lecture now in the history of great philosophers, and we are going to be focusing this semester on Western philosophy. And the beginning of Western philosophy begins in a city called Miletus around the 6th century BCE. Now, when we look at these first philosophers, they were interested in what we might call the big questions, and they were interested in answering these big questions not through mythology, not through tradition, not through religion, but they wanted to answer these big questions with a rational approach to knowledge, using experience and observation, using rational thought. And the big questions that these first philosophers were interested in were questions like, how or why do things come into being? Now, when we think about that question, we might think that that is a question of physics, but these first philosophers were really asking what we might call metaphysical questions. What is the basic substance of reality? Now, certainly these questions touch on physics, but they want to know what the basic stuff is. Is everything reduced to one basic substance, or does everything reduce to many different substances? Now, the first of these Milesian philosophers is a philosopher known as Thales. So Thales, one of the things you should know, is that we don't have any of his actual writings. And in fact, when we look at any of the philosophers before Socrates, so these philosophers are oftentimes referred to as the pre-Socratic philosophers, we really don't have many of their writings. Instead, what we have are secondhand accounts of what these early philosophers did and what they taught. And so this is an account from Plato talking about Thales. So Plato, writing about Thales, said that he once fell into a well while he was looking up at the stars. Now, in fact, this is oftentimes a criticism of philosophers, and this was certainly a criticism of many of the pre-Socratic philosophers back then, to look at a philosopher like Thales and to say that he was so eager to know what was going on in heaven that he couldn't see what was right below his feet. In other words, many people looked at philosophy and said, this is just not practical. And of course, this was said about Thales, but it could have been said about all the philosophers. In fact, Aristotle gives us a similar account, saying that Thales was often criticized because his deep observations weren't practical, and they weren't able to produce an income. And Thales, according to Aristotle, responded to this criticism by applying his knowledge of meteorology, by predicting a heavy crop of olives. And after he made this prediction, he then hired all of the olive presses in Miletus, and he hired them at a very low rate, so that when the season came, he was able to make a considerable fortune, proving that it's easy for philosophers to become rich if they so desire, although, according to Aristotle's account, that's not the business of philosophy, and that's not what philosophy is all about. So right away in the history of philosophy, you have questions about the value of philosophy. Well, what was Thales' big idea? Thales' big idea is that everything reduces to one basic substance, and the basic substance that Thales chose was the substance of water. Now, in Greek thought, oftentimes it was thought that there were at least 4 different substances: earth, fire, air, water, and there was a debate oftentimes between the pluralists and the monists whether or not all the substances were basic in themselves, or whether or not some of the substances could be reduced to just one. Well, Thales was a monist, and he was, you might say, an early naturalist as well, claiming that the first substance, or the basic substance that everything comes from, is waters. Now, this might sound primitive to us today with what we know in science, but I think it's often good to put yourself in the mind of these early philosophers to try to understand what they were getting at. Now, because we don't have Thales' actual writings, oftentimes we're just left with speculation as to why Thales argued that everything is water. Some have proposed that maybe it's the case that uh, Thales wanted to figure out why things didn't feel like they were always falling. So if you think about the strangeness of that, so if we live on the Earth, well, we're fairly stable on the Earth. What's below the Earth? Well, if it was air below the Earth, and so if that's the basic substance that everything rests upon, then wouldn't it feel like we would have this sensation of constantly falling? Well, we don't have that. It feels like things are pretty stable. And so maybe it's the case that the Earth is floating on something like water or water-like substance. Some have proposed that as being the reason why Thales argued that all is water. Some have observed that if you look at life around us, life requires water for existence. We require water to survive, and so maybe that was a reason why Thales argued that all is water. We can't know the precise reason why he argued for this, but the important point is to know that from his perspective, he started a school of thought that said that everything must be reduced to one basic substance, and he happened to pick the substance of water. Now, there was a student of Thales named Anaximander who argued that everything reduces to what he called the apeiron. And to get an idea of what this is, Anaximander writes that everything is either a beginning or it has a beginning, but there is no beginning to the infinite. And so if we ask, what does this word apeiron mean? Well, we might translate it as some sort of infinite, like an infinite boundlessness, an indeterminate boundlessness. This seems to be what Anaximander was arguing for. Well, what could he mean by this? Well, again, if we think about the basic substances that were being thought about in Greek philosophy, at least in Greek thought, you have the earth, wind, fire, water. Well, we might think about Anaximander in terms of a thought experiment. So if you think of these different substances, is it possible for us to imagine these substances not existing? And it was perhaps the case that Anaximander was doing this thought experiment. So you could imagine what it would be like for there to be no fire. You could imagine what it would be like for there to be no water. Now, obviously, if there's no water, you wouldn't have life. But you can imagine what it would be like for there to be no life. You can imagine what it would be like for there to be no air or wind. And you can imagine what it would be like for there to be no earth. And so once you imagine these substances out of existence, you might ask, what's left? Well, as we think about modern cosmology today, we might look at what you see on the screen here, and you might say, well, you still have the whole universe left if you get rid of the Earth. Well, perhaps what Anaximander is doing is saying, even that you could imagine out of existence. And so once you've imagined everything out of existence, the question is, what is this? What is the blank space that after you've imagined everything out of existence, what there is left? And for Anaximander, he called this the boundless, the indeterminate boundlessness. This is the beginning. There's no beginning to this. This is the apeiron. Well, after Anaximander came another philosopher named Anaximenes. And Anaximenes was a student of Anaximander, but perhaps he thought that this boundlessness was a little too abstract, and so he argued that everything could be reduced to air, and that was his proposal. So again, these are the first Milesian philosophers, and they are essentially all arguing that everything could be reduced to We might say a material thing, though we could debate about exactly what Anaximander is talking about, but to some basic thing, and this position is often referred to as materialistic monism. Everything is reduced to one basic substance. Now, at this point, we should stop to consider some fundamental questions in philosophy. So what these early philosophers are really doing is, as I mentioned earlier, trying to get at the nature of reality. So is everything reduced to one basic substance or to many? Furthermore, is the universe rational or is it irrational? How is it that we live in the type of world that is capable of being understood in the first place? Should we believe in materialism? Well, these first three philosophers seem to be arguing yes. Or should we believe in immaterialism? As we'll see in our next lecture, there are philosophers who come later who challenge this idea of materialism, and they argue that everything should be reduced to something immaterial, such as mathematics or numbers. And furthermore, can everything be reduced to one basic substance or to many basic substances? These were the fundamental questions that started the project of Greek philosophy.